Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Allen. In 1860, gold was discovered in the San Juan Mountains, just a few miles north of what is now Silverton. This news brought wave after wave of men and women into the San Juan Mountains, seeking their fortune and fame. Colorado's history is abundant with stories of hope, hardship, and prosperity. Stories of tenacity and courage. The film you're about to view, Iron Horse and Steel Men of the San Juans, tells a story of two such men and their optimistic entrepreneurial adventures and how their paths came to cross in southwestern Colorado. The first to enter the Colorado Territory was a small man, hardly 5 feet tall, who had known only hardship and adversity his whole life. A former captain in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was young, eager, and enthusiastic. Otto Mears was destined to become a powerful and influential tycoon, a man that did what others couldn't. Another Civil War veteran entered the Colorado Territory with the dream of someday owning his own railroad. General William Jackson Palmer saw his dream come to reality with the incorporation of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company. Palmer was a visionary in many respects, in business and in the laying out of cities. His impact on Colorado would be far-reaching. Our story will be told aboard one of the remaining narrow-gauge segments of Palmer's original Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company, the Durango and Silverton. 45 miles of incredible mountain splendor as we travel along the River of Lost Souls between Durango and Silverton, Colorado. These are the incredibly rugged and beautiful San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. Mystifying, unforgiving, luring, and taunting the souls of men to uncover their hidden treasure. In 1860, just prior to the Civil War, a small party of men known as the Baker Party entered the land of the Utes via the Animas River Valley. Early fall storms trapped the group, resulting in severe hardship due to the cold. A few members of the party were killed by hostile Utes. Some members survived to tell the tales of the first glimmer of gold in the San Juans. After the Civil War was over, George Howard, one of the survivors of the Baker expedition, handpicked a small army of men to re-enter the San Juans in search of gold. It was learned there was very little placer gold, and that all of the precious minerals were locked up in veins and would have to be mined with drill steel and blasting powder. Chief Ouray of the Utes protested to the government about all of the trespassers, but the government did very little. Later, it was decided to purchase the San Juans from the Utes with an annual annuity of $25,000 to be paid to the Indians for the relinquishment of 4 million acres of mineral land. The Brno Treaty with the Utes was signed September 13, 1873, and was ratified by Congress in April of 1874. Now the San Juans were legally open to hundreds of gold seekers who had been waiting for the Indians to leave. Soon the San Juans were alive with the sounds of industrious miners, hoping theirs would be the discovery of the day. There was one more major problem left to solve: transportation. There were very few pack trails and hardly any wagon roads to get the necessary goods into the region and the ore out. Transportation was a paramount issue, not only in the San Juans, but all across the Colorado Territory. Meanwhile, back in the Colorado Territorial capital, 11½ years had passed since the first cry of gold was heard in January of 1859. Denver itself was finally receiving rail service. The Kansas Pacific Railroad arrived in Denver August 15, 1870. William Jackson Palmer, a young man employed by the Kansas Pacific, was soon to make railroad history of his own. Palmer saw the potential profits. If only a railroad could serve the mining communities scattered throughout the Rocky Mountains. A railroad into the mountains would need to be unique, narrow and small. This is where Palmer's time in England studying railroading would pay off. Palmer and a group of friends and associates decided to form the Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company. It was incorporated October 17, 1870, and was the first narrow-gauge common carrier in the United States, and the second railroad to originate in Colorado. After a successful fundraising blitz, Palmer had his general manager, Colonel Greenwood, place an order with the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia for the first 3 tiny locomotives, one 240 and two 260 class with a 3-foot gauge. When the critics saw how small they were, Palmer's railroad was dubbed Baby Railroad. Palmer's vision of the Denver and Rio Grande was small with very logical reasons. With small-sized equipment, the price tags were proportionately lower. Construction cost of the right-of-way would be less due to the narrow track separation. Turns in the track could be made much tighter with the small equipment, thus allowing his tiny railroad to go places a standard gauge couldn't consider. On Friday, July 28, 1871, the first spike was driven at the Kansas Pacific, Denver Pacific, and the Denver and Rio Grande Joint Depot in Denver. Ironically enough, there had been no narrow-gauge rail laid for the ceremony, so the tiny Denver and Rio Grande locomotives silently witnessed all of the hoopla atop the Kansas Pacific flat cars that had brought them to Denver. With optimism and enthusiasm, the track crews started laying rails for the 75-mile run to the base of Pikes Peak. By October 21, 1871, in just a little under 3 months, the rails had reached what is now Colorado Springs. Grading and track laying continued on to Pueblo, with the first official train arriving there July 2, 1872. The big money crunch of 1873 slowed new construction for a time, but by 1876 the Rio Grande was laying rails again via the shortest route to Santa Fe, over the 9,400-foot Vita Pass, which brought the rails into the San Luis Valley, arriving at Alamosa in 1878. 1879 brought financial hardship to the Rio Grande. By the fall of that year, Palmer had leased his tiny railroad to its arch rival, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. During 1880, through the courts, Palmer attempted to regain control of his railroad, but to no avail. Jay Gould, a railroad and financial tycoon, came to the rescue of the Rio Grande. Now Palmer, with Gould's financial backing, could get back to building his railroad. 1880 marked the beginning of a massive expansion program. The first leg of the San Juan extension was built to Chama, New Mexico. A twisting and winding route, climbing to an elevation of 10,022 feet at the summit of Cumbres Pass, with grades of 4%, almost matching that of Vita Pass. 1881 was the year of glory for the Rio Grande. Never before or since was there so much track laid. The middle portion of the San Juan extension was constructed from Chama through the rough country of northern New Mexico, eventually paralleling the Animas River at Carbon Junction, just south of what is now Durango. As we arrive in Durango, our trainmen are making ready the 8:15 for Silverton. Durango was founded by the Denver and Rio Grande in July of 1881. The first construction train pulled into the area July 27th of that year. The depot was then built, taking only 6 months to complete, being ready for use in January of 1882. In its 117-plus years of service, there have been literally hundreds of thousands of excited passengers pass through its doors. Situated at the southern end of the Animas River Valley, Durango became an important part of the mining industry as well. Ore smelters were built, and soon it became a center of commerce in the region. It will take us about 3 hours to travel the 45 miles up the Animas River, through valleys and canyons, to the mining town of Silverton, which is surrounded by 13,000-foot peaks. Our average speed will be close to 15 miles per hour. The speed of the train hasn't changed over the years. This is mostly due to the combination of the narrow gauge track and the number of curves along the route. In fact, 15 miles per hour will seem fast as you try to capture that perfect snapshot or soak up the incredible scenery along the way. We will hear many different whistle signals as we travel to Silverton. This is how the engineer communicates with the rest of the train crew and everyone else within hearing distance. There are 16 different signals. Each locomotive has a different sounding whistle, and each engineer has his own style of using it. This was very helpful in the past, as a sharp ear could tell what locomotive was approaching and from what direction, as well as who was operating it. The Durango and Silverton owns 4 classes of locomotives, the smallest of which is a Class 70. Only 6 were built for the Rio Grande by Baldwin in 1887. At present, this locomotive is out of service and is on display in the Durango and Silverton Railroad Museum just adjacent to the Durango Depot. The 470 series locomotives are classed as K-28s, built by the American Locomotive Works in 1923. Engine and tender weigh in at 254,000 pounds. Of the many that were built for the Rio Grande Western, only 3 remain in operation, and all are here on the Durango and Silverton. The 480 series locomotives were the last new narrow-gauge engines purchased by the Rio Grande Western in 1925. They weigh 286,000 pounds and are Baldwin K36s. Last but not least are the Baldwin 490 series locomotives, which were built in 1902 as standard gauge Class C41s. In the late 1920s, they were converted to narrow gauge and became the largest narrow gauge locomotives to ever run the rails. They're now classed as K37s and weigh over 308,000 pounds engine and tender. In 1983 and 84, One of the four K-37s owned by the Durango and Silverton was overhauled in the Durango shops. And in early June of 1984, the huge 497 made history by being the largest locomotive to ever run the Silverton branch. But the 497 was too long for the sharp curves, and after operating for 7 years, in the fall of 1991, it was traded to the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad for K-36 number 482, which needed a great deal of repair. 482 has since been restored and is very happy working in Durango. Number 497 is the last and only operating K-37, and it is certainly one of the favorite locomotives on the Cumbres and Toltec. These latter-day narrow-gauge engines are huge when compared to the tiny locomotives of the 1870s. This photo of the Ute, which was one of the first locomotives purchased by the Rio Grande, is dwarfed by the huge C-41 number 904. This photo was taken in the early 1900s, when 904 was fairly new and the Ute was about 30 years old. The Rio Grande learned that the larger locomotives were needed when pulling heavy loads over the rugged mountain terrain of Colorado. It was also learned that the mechanical brakes were insufficient and unsafe on steep grades. Consequently, the Rio Grande became the first railroad in the country to install air brakes on its trains. It took about 5 months for the construction and track crews to reach Rockwood from Durango, arriving here near Thanksgiving of 1881. Passenger service to Rockwood, however, didn't start until January of 1882. This is one of the several flag stops along the route. We'll be stopped here for a few minutes to pick up passengers. Rockwood marks the beginning of a test of skill, tenacity, endurance, and courage, which were required for the successful completion of the next 2 miles of trackage. Starting at Rockwood, the famous Rockwood Cut, which is 350 feet long and about 35 feet deep. This is where segments of many Hollywood films were shot, Around the World in 80 Days, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, to name a couple. The area known as the High Line is just beyond the Rockwood Cut, and was built by daring men suspended from ropes, hand-drilling powder holes into the hard granite walls, meticulously placing the black powder charges, then scampering to safety seconds before the deafening blast brought tons of boulders and dust raining down and tumbling into the Animas River Gorge 400 feet below. Then came the challenge of building a long, curved wooden trestle to bridge the gap where no fill material was readily available. After serving faithfully for just over 20 years, the trestle burned just after the turn of the century. It was then replaced with fill, which allowed for heavier loads and slightly higher track speeds. The High Bridge marks the second time we cross the Animas and is located at the upper end of the High Line. The original wooden bridge was constructed at the bridge yards in Canyon City, but has since been replaced with a steel structure, allowing heavier locomotives to cross safely. Now that the passengers have boarded, let's enjoy the numerous views between Rockwood and the High Bridge. Water in the San Juans is loaded with minerals, so it's necessary to blow off some steam to clean the mineral deposits from the lower portions of the boilers. It was extremely difficult and costly to construct the Silverton branch. The High Line, for example, cost $100,000 per mile to build in 1882. In 1968, the Silverton branch was designated a National Civil Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers. It has also been designated a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. And on July 11, 1982, a granite monument was dedicated and placed at the Cascade Y by the National Railway Historical Society, honoring 100 years of passenger service on the Silverton branch. Tacoma is the site of a hydroelectric plant which was built in 1905 and still produces power for Durango, Silverton, and the Purgatory ski area. The force of water when harnessed is very productive. However, when spring runoffs are heavy, the force of water is a powerful and destructive one, as shown in this photo from 1911, when over 20 miles of track were swept away in a raging flood. There are many different varieties of wildflowers that bloom in these mountain valleys. The Colorado State flower, white and lavender columbine can be seen, along with Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susan, and a host of others, too numerous to mention. The trees native to this area are ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and several varieties of spruce, including the blue spruce, which is the Colorado state tree. Aspen and cottonwood are mixed in, along with many varieties of underbrush, alder and willow being the most common. By the time we reach Tank Creek, the first water stop, our locomotive is very thirsty. Under average conditions, it will have consumed about 4,000 gallons of water, or at the rate of 180 gallons per mile. In the 1880s, the water stops were more frequent because the water capacity of the tenders was much less, 600 to 2,500 gallons. The K-28s and K-36s carry 5,000 gallons of water and 4 to 5 tons of coal. The Teft Bridge is just ahead, which marks the third time the Animas is crossed. Just to the left side of the bridge and hidden in the trees and underbrush is the site of a sawmill that was operated in the 1890s. It produced mine timbers and railroad ties for the Denver and Rio Grande, as well as for the Silverton Northern Railroad. The Needles Mountains have been and continue to be awe-inspiring, to say the least. Pigeon and Turret Peaks jut up from the valley floor to tower majestically at elevations of 13,961 feet and 13,619 feet above sea level. At this point, the Animas River Valley narrows, from here for the next 16 miles, the Denver and Rio Grande had more than their fair share of trouble keeping the railroad operating in the winter. Snow slides would come crashing down the steep mountain sides, burying the track, and sometimes the train along with it. Snowslide sheds were built, but sometimes the snow load was so great it crushed and swept them away. Oftentimes it was just as effective to tunnel through the snowslide rather than try to remove it. For many years, the Denver and Rio Grande was the only access to Silverton and the many other small mining camps located in the surrounding area. Silverton was sometimes isolated for months at a time, while hard-working railroaders fought to keep the track open through snow, floods, rock, and mudslides. Many a hard day's work was put in by these men, trying to equalize the force of nature, and many times they would return the next day, only to find that their work had been destroyed overnight. We are now at the Needleton Water Tank, which is the second water stop on our way to Silverton. There are only two wooden water tanks left on the Silverton branch, this one and the one at Hermosa. Both tanks have been retired from service. Now old tank car bodies are used to store the water for the locomotives. Directly ahead is Mount Garfield. It was named in honor of President James Abram Garfield, who was shot in the Washington, D.C. train station July 2, 1881. He died 2.5 months later on September 19, 1881. We are now crossing the Animas for the fourth time. The old wooden bridge that was built in 1884 was abandoned in 1964, when heavy spring runoff weakened the abutments. This also marks our entry into Elk Park. It wasn't until late June of 1882 that the first construction train steamed into Elk Park. 7 more miles of track to lay in order to reach Silverton. The track crews were working feverishly to get to Silverton for the 4th of July celebration of 1882, but the Cleveland snowslide was about as far as they got. Even though the rails were 3.5 to 4 miles short of Silverton, Rio Grande officials weren't about to let a small detail like that get in their way. The official arrival celebration took place anyway, on the 4th of July, 1882. Running out of rail was the reason for this slightly embarrassing situation. Palmer had recently started the Colorado Coal and Iron Company in Pueblo to produce rail for the Rio Grande, and the first shipment just hadn't arrived yet. With Colorado Coal and Iron producing steel primarily for the Rio Grande, track layers would never run out of rail again. Since 1874, mining in the San Juans had been growing at a feverish pace. Mines of every size were located from the valley floor to the tops of 13,000-foot peaks. Getting the necessary machinery into these remote locations was an extremely difficult task. Prior to the Denver and Rio Grande's arrival in the San Juans, all of the goods and people moved over toll roads and narrow mountain trails. Teams of horses and mules pulling wagons loaded heavily with food and mining supplies traveled into Silverton from Animas City, then on up to Howardsville, Eureka, Gladstone, and many more small towns, where the goods were transferred to pack trains of mules and donkeys, which carried the materials on up to the mines and the ore down on the return trip. Freight costs were extremely high, so the ore that was transported down the mountain needed to be of the highest grade. By 1882, hundreds of tons of low-grade ore had accumulated in the dumps around the mines and stamp mills. Much optimism was associated with the arrival of the railroad in Silverton, because with the railroad came lower freight costs, making it possible to process the lower-grade ores and transport them to the smelters soon to be built in Durango. Even with the Rio Grande having its terminus in Silverton, didn't solve the problem of economical transportation completely. High freight costs were still a factor in getting the ore from the mines to the stamp mills and on to Silverton. To help reduce the cost of transportation, the mines and stamp mills built an elaborate system of trams which carried the ore down the mountain to the stamp mill. This was an immense help, but solved only half the problem. Through the 1870s to the mid-1880s, many toll roads were built in the San Juans, which helped to reduce the cost of transportation greatly. Instead of donkeys with heavily laden packs walking narrow trails, with toll roads at least, larger quantities of ore and goods could be carried aboard large wagons. One of the toll roads went from Silverton up the Animas River to Howardsville, Eureka, Animas Forks, and Mineral Point. Another from Lake City to Ouray, now known as Engineer Pass, which carried all kinds of commerce, from stagecoaches to prospectors with donkeys. The Saguache and Lake Fork Toll Road, then one from Dallas over Dallas Divide to Sawpit and on to Telluride. Ouray West to the Mount Sneffels Mining District, yet another from Silverton to the Red Mountain Mining District. All of these and many more roads built in the San Juans, including the route of the present-day US 550 from Silverton to Ouray, all have one thing in common: a man by the name of Otto Mears. Mears built almost 450 miles of toll roads in and around the San Juans in the period from 1867 through 1885, which earned him the title Pathfinder of the San Juans. Mears was truly more than a pathfinder. He was an entrepreneur. In 1884, he, Fred Walson, and J.L. Pennington formed the Mears Transportation Company to haul freight from the Red Mountain Mining District to the Rio Grande terminus in Silverton. Mears Transportation grew to become the largest of its kind in the state. But as time went on, Mears realized that animal power was too slow and inefficient. The toll road that he had built from Silverton to the Red Mountain Mining District was of suitable grade for a railroad. The profits would be almost double that of other railroads. So, with a great deal of excitement and some old worn-out pieces of equipment purchased from the Rio Grande, Otto Mears started his first railroad, the Silverton. His first locomotive was formerly the Denver and Rio Grande No. 42, which was originally purchased from Baldwin in 1880, a 280 Class 60N. Mears renumbered it 100 and named it Ouray in honor of his good friend Chief Ouray of the Utes. Construction of the Silverton Railroad started in July of 1887 and was completed in November of 1889. The present-day US 550 from Silverton to the summit of Red Mountain Pass follows the grade and curves laid out by Otto Mears over 100 years ago. Otto had been a prolific road builder, and now with his interests directed toward railroading, he saw his long-time dream come to reality. On October 30th, 1889, the Rio Grande Southern Railroad was incorporated. Robert M. Ridgway was named superintendent of the RGS, and on March 4th of 1890, the RGS Construction Company started work on both the north and south ends of the system. It was planned that the rail bed would closely follow Mears Toll Road from the new town site of Dallas Junction over Dallas Divide through Saw Pit and on to Telluride. By midsummer of 1890, Dallas Junction became known as Ridgeway in honor of the popular RGS superintendent. The line would extend past Ophir Junction and over Lizard Head Pass to the mining town of Rico, which means rich in Spanish, to Dolores, then on to Durango. 164 miles of railroad through some of the most rugged and scenic country in Colorado. The Rio Grande Southern was an engineering challenge to say the least. Long cuts were blasted through the hard granite walls of the upper Dolores River Canyon. There were many long and high trestles. Then there were long, high, and curved trestles. On the Ophir Loop, from the Butterfly Trestle upgrade for roughly 2 miles, there were 9 trestles to cross with an average grade of 3.5%. It was a struggle to reach the summit of Lizard Head Pass. Burros were used to pack the heavy wooden beams from the end of the rail to the canyon floor, where they were hoisted into place, and stick by stick the trestles took shape. It took only a year and 10 months to complete the line. Since work began at both ends, the tracks met close to the halfway point, about milepost 84 between Rico and Dolores on December 19, 1891. The official dedication ceremony took place July 4, 1892. In February of 1890, when Otto went back east on a fundraising trip for the RGS, he stopped in Lima, Ohio on his return trip and bought a shiny new Shea-geared locomotive for his Silverton Railroad. Upon its delivery in April of that year, Otto immediately named it Guston, then loaned it to the RGS, where it was used in the construction of the south end of the route. After completion of the RGS construction, the Guston returned to Silverton and assumed freight duty. But the Shea was too slow to suit Otto. So in late 1892, Otto Mears, as president of the Silverton Railroad, proposed a trade to Otto Mears, president of the Rio Grande Southern. "I'll trade you my Shea for your line engine number 34. Otto concurred with himself, and it was a done deal. Mears had a long and productive relationship with the Denver and Rio Grande since becoming a freight agent for the railroad at Saguache in 1879. The Denver and Rio Grande was investing heavily in the stocks of the RGS, and by the fall of 1892 owned over 50%. Mears had been using the profits from the Silverton Railroad to support the RGS since its beginning, and was just managing to keep the RGS afloat. August of 1893 came a killer blow: the repeal of the Sherman-Silver Act. The government would no longer purchase silver, and silver was the dominant metal of the San Juans. Everything stopped almost instantly. Otto was forced to place the RGS into receivership. Since the Denver and Rio Grande was the majority stockholder, it was appointed by the court to operate the railroad. This was a setback for Otto, but it didn't deter him. In September of 1895, he incorporated the Silverton Northern Railroad, which would follow his toll road from Silverton up the Animas River to Howardsville, Eureka, and eventually on to Animas Forks and Mineral Point. Because of large RGS debt and the lack of ready cash, by November of 1895, Otto was financially desperate. So he made a deal to sell his and his associates' RGS stock to the Denver and Rio Grande. Otto retained just enough stock to remain on the RGS board of directors. With this influx of cash, he could build the Silverton Northern. By June of 1896, the rails were to the large stamp mill at Eureka. 1896 also a presidential election year, and Otto found himself campaigning hard for William Jennings Bryan, who promised to return the nation to the bimetal standard and the prosperity prior to the repeal of the Sherman-Silver Act. The end result: Bryan carried Colorado, but lost the election. The financial situation in the San Juans and the mining industry in general was bleak. Things ground to a halt. People left the San Juans almost as fast as they had come, including Otto Mears. He received a telegram from David Moffett mid-August of 1897, inviting him to go to Washington, D.C. to build a railroad. Otto went. While back east, he became friends with the Mack brothers, who asked for his help in starting the Mack Brothers Motor Car Company. So, in the fall of 1902, Otto became the first president of what is now the Mack Truck Company. And while there, he got the idea of putting one of those funny-looking auto buses on a set of rail trucks. So he did, and sent it back to the San Juans, where it was put to work on his railroads, carrying tourists on excursions. Yes, Otto Mears was undoubtedly the inventor of the idea, which later became the Galloping Goose of the Rio Grande Southern. Over the next few years, there were spurts of mining activity, enough to prompt Otto to complete the Silverton Northern from Eureka to Animas Forks in 1904. It was truly a scary thing with grades of 7%. It was all a locomotive could do to pull one empty up, and if the rails were slick, it was like a bobsled run coming down. And that was the way the mining industry was headed, in a downward slide that couldn't be stopped, a slide that would take the narrow-gauge railroads of the San Juans with it, save one. The banks of the Animas River have been becoming increasingly red in color, which is due to the mining and stamp mill processing of the many thousands of tons of ore extracted during the mining glory days over 100 years ago. Crossing the Animas for the fifth time brings us into an open valley surrounded by 13,000-foot peaks. It was first known as Baker's Park in the 1860s and is now the home of Silverton. The first passenger train steamed out of Animas Canyon and into Silverton July 11, 1882. Since then, hundreds of thousands of tons of concentrates have been carried over these rails, and many a hopeful prospector has ridden anxiously into Silverton. What they found probably wasn't what they expected. Some stayed and some moved on. But not many left this valley with their pockets full of gold. For those who stayed saw greater wealth in the beauty of this place, and the surrounding mountain peaks with their everlasting natural and untamed beauty. Yet the San Juans constantly beckon us from just beyond the horizon, just as they did the Baker Party in the 1860s, and the Utes before them. The iron horse and steel men of yesteryear carried hardy men and women with high hopes and big dreams into these rugged and untamed mountains. Today, their legacy lives on with the men and women of the Durango and Silverton, and those of us that wish to reach out and touch and experience a bit of the past. General William Jackson Palmer, founder of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, also found himself deeply involved in the laying out and development of Colorado Springs. He formed other companies such as the Colorado Coal and Iron Company located in Pueblo. He built a hospital in Salida for his DNRG employees, as well as Glen Eyrie, his famous home in Colorado Springs, where he and his daughters lived after his wife died. In 1906, the general was injured in a horseback riding accident, which left him paralyzed. Because of this, he was unable to travel and attend his 35th annual Civil War Veterans Reunion. So, instead of missing out on a good party, the general brought all 280 of his 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry Unit to Colorado Springs, where they had the time of their lives. 2 years after his fall, the general died at age 73. Otto Mears finally entered semi-retirement at the age of 80 and moved to California with his wife Mary. On August 29, 1926, a special dedication ceremony at the site of his toll booth at Bear Creek Falls on the Ouray and Red Mountain Toll Road took place. Otto was officially honored and named as Pathfinder of the San Juans. Unfortunately, he was unable to attend due to failing health. 2 years later, at the age of 88, Otto felt the San Juans beckon his return. So he went to those majestic mountains in southwestern Colorado for one last time and viewed the stone monument that had been dedicated in his honor. In 1931, Otto passed away in California at the age of 91.